Evening. I think we'll get started. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout. I'm Dietrich Neumann. I'm the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center. And as you can see, this is number 24 of our conversations. And it has been great fun. We've been bringing artists and architects and thinkers and writers and social activists together here. And we've had lots of really good conversations. And I must say, for this whole semester, I've been looking forward to this night. And I know many of you have as well, because tonight we have Jen Howard here and Gina Borromeo from the RISD Museum. And they will discuss their de-accessioning and the whole debate around the overhead from Benin, which is, of course, a topic not just talked about at RISD. I was just in Berlin with a group of students, and there the Humboldt Museum also discusses that. So it's a really interesting question. So I'll just quickly, many of you know Jan and Gina, and I'll just quickly introduce them one by one. So Jan came to RISD in 2000, so that's like 22 years. Yeah. And before that, you were in Baltimore at the Museum of Art for 14 years, so you're really loyal to your institutions. You stayed a long time. And you were a curator in the Department of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, and before you had trained at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Spencer Museum at the University of Kansas, where you did your graduate work, and then you came to RISD and you became chief curator here, and you just stepped down from that position 2 years ago. And Jan is now the Houghton P. Metcalf Jr. Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs. And I've seen many of your shows, all really memorable, and of course mostly about prints and photographs and drawings. And I remember fondly that great show about architectural drawings from the collection of Alvin Boyarsky. It was called Drawing Ambience. There was in last year Shazia Sikandar, Extraordinary Realities, America in View, that many of you might remember, landscape photography since 1865, many others. Aaron Siskin, of course, I have to mention, the wonderful Rhode Island photographer, and many others. So this is Jan, and Gina has been at RISD even longer. Astonishingly, we just figured out that I think we already knew each other when you were a student, and I had just arrived at Brown in the late 80s, and then you had gone to Wheaton for undergraduate, and then Brown for your master's and PhD. After that, you went to the Art Institute of Chicago for 2 years. But then what happened is, of course, exactly the magnetism that happens to many of us of Providence that just pulled you back from Chicago, out of all places, which is a really attractive city. But you came back and you went to RISD, and then you sort of climbed through the ranks here. You came in 95, and then first curatorial assistant curator, associate curator, curator, and then chief curator, which is the job you took over from Jan 2 years ago. And so you've taught at Brown and RISD, won a ton of grants, and written a very long, I have your whole list here. I'm not going to read all of the long list of publications, but you're still connected with Brown, which is nice. You've been on the board of the Hafenreffer, on the board of the Joukowsky Institute. And so it's just such a delight to have you both here, and I look forward to your presentation. So please help me welcome Jan and Gina.
So thank you, Dietrich, for the invitation to join all of you tonight. And I am really delighted to see friends and new friends also. So I would like first of all, at the very outset, thank Jan Howard, who has been my partner in this work for many years now. For 4 years, she and I have worked together on the Benin Head, and we started working together when Jan was chief curator, and we began thinking about what to do with this head that was published in 2017, and it was revealed to us that its origins may have been problematic. And so I will start with that. And so here we go. Aside from a collection of African textiles, which have been exhibited occasionally only, the RISD Museum doesn't have a substantial collection of African art or an African art curator on staff. However, there is one significant object, this cast bronze head from the Benin Kingdom that you see on the screen. The ancient kingdom of Benin, located in present-day southern Nigeria, was founded by the Edo people. It was one of the most powerful of Africa's historical kingdoms, and it was already a thriving city-state when Portuguese explorers came to the area in 1490. The piece at the Rizzi Museum depicts the head of an Oba, the king, the ruler of Benin. Only the Oba could be shown wearing the coral bead crown that you see here. For the Benin people, the human head was imbued with spiritual energy that guides individuals throughout their lifetimes. It determines a person's destiny. The human head also marked the personal and physical identity of an individual and tied the individual to family, to ancestors, to the extended family, and also to the community. So one of the first tasks of an incoming Oba was actually to commission an idealized head of his predecessor from bronze casters who worked for the royal court. This head that was commissioned served to honor and usher the deceased Oba into the pantheon of ancestor kings. It also provided a way for the ruling Oba to access the wisdom of past Obas. So it was a direct connection to the line, and in that respect also a connection to all the collected wisdom of the entire dynasty of rulers. Upon completion, the head was placed alongside others on a royal ancestral altar in the palace. There were 35 of these ancestral shrines in the palace, one for each of the unbroken line of Obas dating back to 1440. This image shows the bronze and brass heads at the foot of Oba Ebuare II's throne during his coronation ceremony in the royal palace in 2016. This gives us an idea of the continuing crucial role of these heads. Before going further, I'd like to share a brief history of what led to the dispersal of the Benin bronzes. During the so-called Scramble for Africa in the 19th century, the Kingdom of Benin managed not only to remain independent, but also dominate trade in the area, which Britain's Royal Niger Company found extremely problematic. The British were interested in the kingdom's rich natural resources, such as palm oil, rubber, and ivory. And in 1892, a British delegation visited Benin City, hoping to open up trade, to annex the Kingdom of Benin, and to transform it into a British protectorate. After unsuccessful attempts at annexation, British troops sacked the Kingdom of Benin in 1897. They burned cities, sent the reigning king, Ova Ovonramwen, into exile, and looted works of art and other treasures from the royal palace. The British Museum accessioned about 40% of the looted works. Some were given to the armed forces as spoils of war, and the rest were sold at auction to pay for the expedition. Most of the Benin bronzes sold at auction were purchased by museums, mainly in Germany, which holds many of the Benin bronzes still around today. The history of ownership of an object is called provenance, and this kind of collection research is part of what curators do behind the scenes. At the Rizzi Museum, the Benin head is only one of many objects for which provenance research is ongoing. Before I go into the provenance of the Benin head, I want to acknowledge that provenance research is both crucial and difficult to do because sales catalogs capture only a fraction of the changes of ownership of these pieces. And even when an object can be linked to a catalog, the object isn't often illustrated, so confirming a match between an object and a description is often tricky. So on to the provenance of the head at RISD. Miss Lucy Truman Aldrich donated it to the Rizzi Museum in 1939. In 1935, her sister, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, also donated a similar head to the Harvard Art Museums. An exhibition at MoMA in the 1930s brought attention to African art in the United States, and it sparked a growing interest in that material here. The accession card that you see on the screen here states that the head was number 5 in a catalog called Bronzes and Ivories from the Old Kingdom of Benin for an exhibition held at the Knoedler Gallery in New York in 1935. The catalog describes it as the head of a princess, but without a photograph. I searched the sales books, commissions books, and letter recording books of the Knoedler Gallery archives, digitized and accessible through the Getty Research Institute, but with no results. I couldn't find anything more about this head. In fall of 2019, though, I was able to gain access at the Getty Research Institute to a box of, actually 3 boxes of material from the Knoedler galleries. I found a catalog number, a catalog which was annotated, and luckily, and the annotations next to number 5 on that catalog really came as a big surprise to me. It said, the note said that it was sold in 1935, not to the known donor, Miss Lucy Truman Aldrich, but instead to a certain Mrs. M.S. Danforth and to Carol Carstairs. Now, Mrs. Danforth was then the president of RISD, and she often acquired objects through Carol Carstairs. And it's really likely that Miss Danforth purchased the piece on behalf of Miss Aldrich, who then donated it to the museum. Further digging, this time in the RISD archives, showed that Miss Aldrich donated a catalog of a 1932 exhibition of Benin objects in Paris to the RISD library. So we know that as early as 1932, she was already interested in Benin material. We then turn to the head itself for clues. Inside the head is a sticker that reads "Imported from France," and also a stamp that says Douane, France. The 1930s, when we acquired this object, was when many soldiers who took part in the 1897 raid on Benin passed away, and their heirs were busy selling off the Benin material in their possession. Benin art flooded the art market. They were purchased, these objects were purchased by museums and collectors in Europe and in the United States in a second wave of purchases, the first one having occurred right after the raid in 1897. It's clear from these stamps and the sticker that a French dealer or collector had this object at one time. But whatever my continued search for provenance uncovers, as more sales records may or may not become available in the future, it is almost certain that the bronze head was looted in the 1897 raid on Benin. So I'll turn it over to Jan for a little bit, and then I'll come back on. But
She's going to continue talking. I thank Gina for all the work that she's done on the Benin bronze for these many years. She's kind of been the person, even though her expertise is ancient art, she's been the one to be really looking out for this piece for a great many years, not only doing provenance research, but as classes have wanted to see it, she's the one who's often taken on that responsibility. So, but I would say we both feel very confident that a piece as important as the Benin bronze would never have left the kingdom had it not been looted. It's just not the kind of thing that would be given away with the importance that it has within the community. So that alone really convinces us that it had to have been part of this. But Gina has, we don't really have a context for putting this piece up in the museum because we have such a tiny African collection, mostly African textiles, and so it doesn't have a context within African work. We have often put it up. This is a label when Gina had it up in her Greek and Roman galleries where she was trying to put it in the context of technique. And you can see from the label here that she speaks about it in the context of other bronze objects with the lost wax casting technique and included goddesses, our Greek goddess Aphrodite and other things from the Hellenistic period as well as the later Roman lion's head. So, but mostly in recent years, we've had it in the European galleries. We've had it there in order to put it in the context of the time in which it was made, or we've put it there more recently. Our interpretation of those galleries has leaned toward really making more evident the empire building at this particular moment in history. And so we've sometimes, we want to emphasize that a little bit more, and having it in that context makes a little bit more sense for us. But every time we do put it in the galleries, we do a new label, recontextualize why it's there. But we're also trying to tell you what we're learning in the process of putting up these new labels. So the last paragraph of this label that I have up right now talks about how for the first time we really faced its looted status and talked about how we were initiating communication with the current Oba of Benin, and how we had initiated communication with the National Commission of Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, so that people would know, and just recognizing and embracing the opportunities we had to confront injustices that had been done in the past. So that, along with the other thing that changes in this label that we wrote was, Gina really was more involved in the writing of these labels. I shouldn't say we. But in one of the Brown classes, we talk about this object quite a lot with the classes, and that is really one of the reasons that it's on view so often, is because in recent years, particularly in the last 5 years, I would say, many people at Brown and RISD both want to teach, about the history of this piece. They want to have conversations about this, so there's been more demand for it to be on view, and so we've worked with different ways. But in one of the Brown classes, one of the students said to us, "I don't understand why you're calling this the Benin Punitive Expedition," which is the raid on Benin in 1897. They felt that language wasn't strong enough, and weren't we more forceful about what really happened there? And she suggested that we call it the Benin Massacre, and actually we have changed the labels to use that kind of language as we've written labels going for, from that time. This shows you another installation view of the Benin bronze. In conversation with the contemporary work by Pablo Bronstein, we sometimes do put contemporary works in other spots in the museum. In this case, we wanted to amplify those conversations around colonialism, and this work by Pablo Bronstein is a fantastical clock, but based on the kind of drawings that would have been done at the time in the 18th century, and it's a clock that has Paris's face in the center, and around it are the colonies of France, so it's Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire and others. He's really trying to talk about how, ornaments such as this were made possible by the wealth of colonialism. And in each of these clocks, you see the commodity that's associated and what was taken from each of these colonies. So it was just another way to depict, the wealth that was built on the backs of the colonies, and how objects like this clock and other objects in that gallery were possible because of that kind of wealth. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the journey of us confronting the looted history of this piece. And so this, back in 2017, was when we first asked Smoot Neswi, who was then a curator of African art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, to do a really in-depth article about this for our journal manual, so that we would have a better understanding of the piece and its history. And we have really relied on that article that he wrote at that time to help us interpret it as we have talked with other groups and continue to work on this. Around that time, not long afterwards, there were a couple of initiatives that happened in Europe that were important to the conversation going on around the looted Benin pieces. This is the Benin Dialogue Group, and in the fall of 2018, they reported that they were working with representatives from museums around Europe, working with colleagues in Benin and Nigeria to return pieces through loans for a planned Benin Royal Museum. And shortly after that was announced, the paper came out that I'm sure many of you may be familiar with, that was commissioned by Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, known as the Sar and Savoie Report, which was Its full title is The Restitution of African Cultural Heritage Toward a New Relational Ethics. And it called for the return of objects looted from the African colonies. And so these two initiatives really spurred us to really begin learning what kinds of initiatives were going on in the United States. Neither of us being African curators, we really didn't know what was going on in the field. So it was important for us to start contacting colleagues around the United States to find out what was going on. Well, there wasn't an initiative like you saw in Europe at that time, but there, of course, our colleagues had relationships that they had built in Nigeria, both in Benin City, but in Nigeria generally, and they were very generous in sharing their contacts and sharing how they built relationships, and so that we could begin to build a relationship of our own there. But while we were doing this work, and as these reports came out, we had a little protest at the RISD Museum called Heads Up, where the students, it was mostly Brown faculty and students with a few RISD people, who were asking us to repatriate the Benin bronze. And so their action really made us realize a lot of things that, we weren't being very transparent about what we were doing and the research that we were doing. So we invited them to come and speak with us. We also put out a statement about the work that we were doing and the provenance research that was happening. And so it's why the provenance page is now on our website. That went up in response to this, that we realized, well, we're doing lots of provenance research, but we're not letting people know this kind of behind the scenes work that goes on at the museum. So that was something that we did to be a little more transparent. And then I have to say, our staff has been the whole staff at the RISD Museum has been as strong as advocate as anyone for the return of this piece and for us building relationships in Nigeria. And when we did have the protests, the whole staff came together to come to that meeting with the protesters, because we had been meeting already in these all-staff dialogues where we were confronting difficult issues that are facing museums today. So we had a kind of way to speak with each other and to support each other in this process. And we were able to I have to say that they've always been, I feel like they have our backs, when we're doing this research, and it's really great to know. And they also push us. They're also asking us, so what's happening now? Where do you, what's going on? We haven't heard from you in a little while. So that's been very helpful. But we've also used some public programs to try to make our work more transparent. And this is on an occasion when we invited Peju Laiwolo. She is a sculptor from Benin City. She's part of the royal family, still working in the same tradition. And it was so moving, really, to hear her speak, because she talks about how she has to travel to see such important objects, such as the piece that we have here at the RISD Museum right now. And that kind of resource should be available to them in their community. So following that conversation, Gina and I led a conversation in the galleries. Gina and I most always do the speaking about this piece together because we've both, we've done different parts of the work on it, and we feel more comfortable speaking with each other. So that's why you have both of us tonight. But anyway, this was an opportunity for the public to hear a bit about what we had been doing and also to ask questions. So we want to be available to people if they have questions about the work. So not long after this, the protest itself was reported in this online journal, Hyperallergic. And then a few months later, one of the writers for the journal came to Gina and I and asked if she could interview us about the work. And so we were happy to speak to her about that. And it was really actually quite good to talk to her. She had been the director of a museum, and she was very sensitive to how difficult it is to do the kind of work we're doing, especially in trying to figure out a path for restitution when really a process hadn't yet been established. And we were also outside of the field, so she could understand what we were facing trying to do this work. So I thought it was a really good article. It's available if you want to take a look at it. But it was also helpful to us because it got the word out a bit more about our intention to return the piece, and also that we were interested in working with other American museums in doing this work. And some museums at that point began to call us and ask us about how we were doing this and where we were in the process. So that was just helpful in engaging with others. Also, that same summer that the hyperallergic article came out, our work seemed to get a little more widely known even further afield. This Twitter call came from the Pitt Rivers Museum for images of Benin displays and labels. And so it was done by Dan Hicks at the Oxford University. He asked people to post these, and ours was among the first to be posted, and it was posted by his boss, the director there, Laura van Brockenhoven, and she was acknowledging that our label had been influential in the work that they were doing in their museum. And then this Twitter feed itself led to Hicks' important book, The Brutish Museums, which was published in 2020, which has been really instrumental in shifting attitudes about the return of the looted works. So Gina and I really continue to educate ourselves. We meet with colleagues regionally and further afield again, attending conferences. This was a really important conference, I felt, the restitution debate that was held at Columbia University back in 2019, because Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy spoke there among many African scholars. So this was a really informative one. And then they had a follow-up not long, a couple of years later. It didn't feel long, but you know, it was a virtual conference at that time, but it was focused more on what work was being done in Nigeria to prepare for the return of many of these objects. And so both of those were really critical for us to attend. But I would say, of all the presentations we've heard, maybe these are the most memorable, the ones by Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy. Felwine Sarr was especially passionate about the need for the people of Benin to be able to rebuild their culture, and how deeply meaningful it would be to have these pieces returned. The Benin people, of course, they live with the history of the trauma of this event, as you could see from Peju's work, which continues to consider this event. He talked about bringing the promise of a new economy, of exchange, new life, new meaning to the works restituted. And he sees restitution as a path to a new respect for past achievements within the society itself. You know, we heard that message reiterated so many times when we've heard from the African speakers. And I feel it's one of the most important things we hear when we're at these talks, because I think for me, when you hear from them, it's an understanding that you feel in your heart, not just in your head. You know it's the right thing to do. But then you can really understand, you know, how deeply critical it is for this to shift, and how people are thinking about these pieces outside of Nigeria. But also Benedict Savoy's talk was also a revelation, because she spoke about how close Europeans came to restituting this work back in the 70s. There was a lot of press back there about this happening. There was a restitution forum in 1981 that involved UNESCO and France, East and West Germany. There was all this political will to return it, but at that point, the museums rose up in opposition. So, and no one had really remembered. It kind of was one of these things that happened, but it was kind of out of everyone's memory until they began to do the research for the Sarr and Savoy report. So I feel things are very different at this point. And that there's a lot of momentum for building, you know, a return of the bronzes to finally return home. And I think colleagues across the ocean have really been leading the way at this point. And so Gina will talk about some work that she did speaking with colleagues in the UK.
Okay, thanks, Jan. So I don't know if any of you caught Benedict Savoy's talk last night at Bard College. She spoke very eloquently again about amnesia and aphasia, and how she was shocked when she and Felwine Sarr wrote the report that all this work had actually been done 40 years ago and people had forgotten. And one of the things that forced, I would say that maybe put the whole African repatriation issue to the back was Melina Mercouri's appeal for the return of the Parthenon marbles to Greece. When that issue rose up, that became, and it still is, basically the talking point, the focal point of all restitution questions. So I want to just talk to you about, ongoing work that we did after Jan and I attended all those conferences. So right before the pandemic, in February 2020, I traveled to the UK, and at the British Museum, I met with the African curators, Lysant Bolton and Julie Hudson. Both are members of the Benin Dialogue Group, and they were able to share with me then the group's work and ongoing plans in Benin City to build a royal museum next to the palace of the Oba, where returned objects will eventually be displayed. From there, I traveled to the Pitt Rivers Museum, where I met with Dan Hicks, curator there, also author of that wonderful book, Brutish Museums. Dan Hicks is the Oxford representative to the Benin Dialogue Group. Dan had worked with a man named Mark Walker, who was the grandson of one of the British soldiers who had participated in the Benin raid in 1897. And Mark had inherited the objects from his grandfather, and he felt that they really did not belong to him. So Dan worked with Mark to bring the ceremonial paddles to the Pitt Rivers Museum, where they are currently being displayed, while things in Nigeria are set up to receive works. So Mark Walker personally returned 2 objects to the Oba when he traveled to Nigeria in 2015, but these are additional objects that he uncovered in his grandfather's home. Another result of these collaborations is the creation of the Digital Benin Project, a database of all the Benin's objects scattered across the globe, something that has been called for decades. So although we can't reunite all these objects together in person, we can at least reunite them digitally, their images and their records. We are participating and have forwarded all the related documents, research, and images of the head of the Oba. And in the first year alone of this project, they received data sets from 119 museums in 18 countries with close to 5,000 objects. So in parallel to that, there are oral history accounts recorded for the contextualization and grounding of the information received by the museum partners. Over the past 3 years, we also spoke regularly to our Fine Arts Committee and our museum board members, one of whom is sitting very prominently over there, who ultimately approved the deaccession. There was also regular communication between the museum and college administration and board members. So by the time we brought the deaccession to a vote in September of 2020, it had become one of the museum's and the college's anti-racist goals to repatriate this object to Nigeria. We had no resistance whatsoever to the proposal at that point. We are now in a place to move forward with the return and are working with the National Commission of Museums and Monuments, which has the OBA's full support in overseeing the return. The new label that we created after the deaccession makes clear that the piece is now deaccessioned and on view while we make arrangements for its return. Having it remain on view has allowed Jan and me and other members of the RISD Museum staff to continue to discuss issues of colonialism and reparations with classes that visit from RISD and Brown. And so Jan will close with our last comments.
So all along, we've always felt that the press has been very helpful to this, the return moving forward. Here you see some recent headlines, and actually the image on the right, you see a headline with from ArtNet about a London museum which was going to plan to repatriate some of its Benin bronzes. And they used to illustrate this article the Benin bronze head that's at the RISD Museum with the little credit line, I don't know if you can read that below, saying that we had deaccessioned it in 2020. So again, it's part of the conversation that's going on more broadly. But I think within universities, you really see this moving forward. I think the Cambridge Museum at Jesus College, their Benin bronze was recently returned, as well as work from the Aberdeen University. So this has been, I think, really helpful for our work going forward. I think they're really setting the plan for how we could move forward, and it's been helpful for us in, with our conversations with the National Commission of Museums and Monuments. But the Professor Tajani, who is the director at the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, you know, is really calling for this, saying we'd like other museums and institutions across the world to take this opportunity and follow suit. So for me, what's going on in Germany right now is really important because as a nation, they have signed a memorandum of agreement with the National Commission of Museums and Monuments to repatriate Benin bronzes, and they have over 1,100 bronzes in that nation, so that's a huge, the fact that they want to do this. When I first started talking to people in Germany at the very beginning of this, which was only a few years ago, when I spoke with the curators, they were saying, we initially proposed lending back these things because as curators, that's what we had the power to do, and we knew there were state laws that would prohibit the return of these things, and we didn't know if our efforts changing the laws would be fruitful. So we wanted to at least move forward with the loan of these objects. And I think I never thought we'd see this happen so quickly, that as a nation, these laws have changed so quickly that they are returning or making plans to begin returning this year. So, and if you want to look, they have also done an inventory of all of the objects, the Benin bronzes in Germany at this point, which you can find online. And I don't think the digital Benin is online for everyone to see yet. It's still being built, but at least Germany is making visible what they're doing. And that's really, I think, you know, helpful for what's going on in the United States at this point. I finally see things happening in the United States. So the Smithsonian, which is the National Museum for African Art here, has taken a real leadership position and said that they are planning to return bronzes. They've taken them off view. So there's definitely forward momentum. And there is now a group of curators, African art curators in the United States, who are working on these issues. Gina and I just joined a couple of the kind of working groups for that. So we really are hopeful that there's a real shift happening, and we very much look forward to returning this extraordinary head to its home as the timing works for the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. And we hope it's just the beginning of a relationship with our colleagues in Benin City. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Maybe we can just stand here.
Yeah, if you have questions for
Oh, we need to be there so you can see us, right?
or hear us, I think.
Oh, so my question is an easy one. How big is it?
About that stuff.
But there are some much larger.
In the back?
I'd like to ask a very delicate question.
Sure.
And please don't take it as an indictment
No.
in terms of Rhode Island Civil Designs Museum. To me, I think that much of this consternation could be eliminated if nationally, internationally, there were more either Africans or people of color on staff to address this particular issue. For an example, I got my PhD at Brown University, and I had a colleague, graduate student colleague, who went to Winterthur. She couldn't even get a job. And I personally knew Margaret Burroughs, who was responsible for the DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago, and she was the one in the early 60s that made me aware of this whole issue in terms of African art, whatever. But I think another concern, I think that probably impacts both of you, RISD and other museums, is the political strife in Nigeria right now. because you want to make sure, I think that the audience needs to hear this, that you want to make sure that it ends up in a museum rather than somebody else's home. That needs to be addressed too as well. So how are you all navigating that? Because it's tough just leaving RISD and going to Nigeria, or going to, you know, London, or going to another place when you don't know what what's going on. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on the first point, and it's something we're working to change at the museum. We're very actively, that's something, I don't know, you might want to look on our website where we have our anti-racist goals, and you can see lining up, that's one of the goals we have for the museum, among many others, and we, you know, tell you how we're doing with trying to meet these goals, so you can follow that, but it's definitely work we're trying to do as well. It's all, I think, related.
And in terms of the second question, if I may just address that, I think that we have been very conscious of the fact that this piece, like the many others that left in 1897, were stolen from the royal palace, and which is very different from the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria. Nigeria wasn't even a state then.
Right.
And so we are going by the Oba's wishes, and he has named the National Commission for Museums and Monuments as the proper intermediary to return the objects, and that's what we're prepared to do. So, Vin?
But is there right now designated a safe harbor for these to go in? If all the restitution and things are taken care of, is there a safe place for them to be contained and to live now? That's relative to your question, of course.
Yeah. They did form the Legacy Restoration Trust in Nigeria, and it is a private trust that is in Benin City itself, and they are building a storage house, a storage facility to house these objects in preparation for their return to Nigeria. So there is that element, but again, we are waiting for the orders from the Oba, because it's really not ours, and whatever he wants to do with it is
I
his.
feel like it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes?
So somebody like Lucy Truman Aldrich, who travels, goes on, collects lots of art, with the intention of one day showing it and having everybody like see it and enjoy it, quote unquote, or like Isabella Stewart Gardner or something like that. When they acquire things from Asia or Africa or anywhere, what are they told about where it came from? Like, I'm sure like the whole, like the sacking of the city was very brushed to the side,
Distant at that point.
I'm sure they didn't know, I would assume they didn't know specifically that, but like, what are they told, or do they even ask, like, oh, where'd you get this, because I mean, I get the whole, I think they have good intentions, and it's, given the time period and stuff like that, and they want to show people, exotic things from around the world. Do they have any idea of what is really happening when they're purchasing these things, or, is there like a hush about it, like, oh, I think it might come from this, like there's just nothing? There's like beautiful giving,
Yeah, I mean, we have some records in the Aldrich collection that, say where they acquired things, but I don't think we have long histories, and that's certainly something that's shifted in the museum field over this period of time since she was collecting. We do try to get more provenance records as we collect things. That's something that, for certain kinds of works, we definitely have to have provenance before we would bring them into the collection. So, and we wouldn't bring something into the collection today that we weren't sure we could have. We didn't feel comfortable with the provenance, so we had gaps in the provenance that might be problematic.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that completely answers your question.
Well, and I'm sure too, they have like somebody who kind of goes out and finds some of the art and stuff like that to a certain extent. Yeah, I was wondering how long, if they ever thought about, gee, how do they get this? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
I'm sure
have
they
no
didn't
idea what
just
she
go.
knew.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it seems to me this has been a perennial problem with art from the very beginning. You know, and I would wonder now that technology is getting better and so forth. I mean, in theory, you could make a copy of this now using what do you call it?
Digital.
A 3D printer or something. Whereas previously, you know, I know years ago, you would go to a museum and you would see, this is a plaster cast of this great Greek thing from before time almost. So is there, I mean, I'm all for, you know, how do you guarantee that the original object will be looked after well? And how do you somehow also preserve it so that, for instance, people in Rhode Island could study it without having to go to Nigeria? You know, it's, you know, in some ways I think that's the bigger picture, and I certainly don't have any idea as to what's the best way to do it.
Well, I mean, that, the rights to the image itself are perhaps not ours, you know, at the museum.
Yeah.
So again, what we might do in that way, I don't know how we can, yeah, we have had, a lot of people have asked that question, I have to say, and a lot of people have interest in maybe seeing a 3D print of this made. For me, and I think for many of us in the museum, we're kind of more interested in seeing, you know, acquiring work by a sculptor such as Peju Laiola, who is still working in this tradition, and, you know, having something today. I don't know exactly what we're going to do. I do think we will acquire something that will keep the connection to this piece, you know. But that's something that we'll continue to talk about.
Thank you very much, Jan and June. It was wonderful talk. Nice to see you in person finally. 2 questions. One question I wanted to ask regarding your colleagues at the MFA in Boston and the Benin Gallery. There's about 32 pieces from the Benin Kingdom. I was wondering if you can talk about those conversations, because on the MFA site, it just talks about how the Benin Gallery has been set up to, you know, contribute knowledge to the neighboring communities within Boston, which I haven't seen anything about deaccessioning or any kind of conversations with the Kingdom of Benin, or Republic of Benin rather. Second, I was just wondering if you're going to have any more contemporary art conversations, because what struck me the most was when the head was facing, I believe it was the Yinka Shinobore piece, Courtiers number 5. And I thought that was extremely powerful. So when I teach my students at RISD, I have them kind of do objects in conversation, and a lot of them were extremely taken by the conversations that are happening in those galleries. So I was wondering if you could speak about the MFA side, and then also if there's any plans with the contemporary while it's here to have any more conversations like that.
You know, the answer to your first question is very easy, I think, for both of us, because we really don't know what the MFA is doing. I know that they feel a responsibility to their community because there's a large Nigerian population in Boston, but I don't know if they have special arrangements with the OBA or with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. But in terms of the contemporary, I'm going to turn it over to Jan, who works with.
I mean, I know in Boston that they did do that display initially with the Benin Kingdom, with people from that community who came over for that opening, and so it was done in conversation with them, because they do have such a large kind of Benin community there in Boston. And I think that's an issue. I mean, I think that perhaps not everything will be returned to Benin's kingdom, because they may want some things to stay, say, at the MFA in Boston. And for us, knowing that there's that large group in Boston, it seems like our Rhode Island audience can easily travel there. Most people in Rhode, not everyone, I know that's not true for everyone, but a lot of people can still have access to work not very far away, certainly not as far away as it is for someone from Nigeria to try to come here to see our work, you know, so that seems, but I would expect that, you know, we have enjoyed, you know, bringing those contemporary pieces into conversation in that gallery. We don't have a plan for something coming up next, but any curator can propose such a thing, you know, and so that's certainly something that probably will happen again.
Yes?
I have a question. You spoke briefly about lending or loaning out work. I know at the British Museum they were kind of talking about loaning as opposed to giving back, because that's a way of sort of maintaining authorship and control. How effective do you think lending is, or do you see it as I kind of see it as just a means of stating authorship and ownership?
I think it, in the case of the British Museum, I think I may be mistaken, but I think it would take an act of parliament for them to be able to return those objects, because it does belong to the nation. And I think that the curators there, Lysant Bolton and Julie Hudson, had proposed loans as a temporary measure, as a way for the objects to be in Nigeria or to return to Nigeria on I believe they were hoping for a long-term loan, you know, or an indefinite loan. But it is a strange thing when the rightful owners of a body of work, and they're not even works of art, they're important cultural belongings, when the owners have to ask for a loan or have to be satisfied with a loan of something that was forcibly taken from them. There is something a little odd in that.
That's why I'm hoping what's happening in Germany will have some impact, you know.
Yes.
That's why I think the Christie's Museum should receive a bunch of kudos, because you have nowhere near the problems that MFA have in Boston. So, no, seriously, in terms of community involvement, I think a lot of this started with Frank Robinson, or even before Frank, in terms of the museum really making itself available to the community. Yeah, I think that needs to be said too as well.
That's something unique about it as a university museum. I've never been in a university museum that is so engaged with the community, and where the community feels such ownership, really, of the institution. And I think that's something we want to continue. Everyone only wants to make that grow.
Quick question about this wonderful process that you went through to find the provenance. And I wonder, sounds maybe a little provocative, but if this is the tip of the iceberg, and if maybe in the museum at RISD or elsewhere, there might be other objects where it's worth checking the provenance, and it might turn out that they were acquired in an illegal fashion. I remember my father, whom you met many years ago, he would always sort of chuckle and said, if you looked at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, it started with the Chesnola collection, who was a famous antique dealer and brought lots of artifacts from Cyprus to New York. And my father, who was not by no means a radical, he said, I think they were all stolen and they should be returned, right? So that's the heart of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so I'm just wondering if this process is something you want to apply to other pieces, if you have suspicions that there might be other pieces that should be looked at.
I think in every collection there are those pieces, and I think that it's just we do have to do due diligence, and every claim that comes will be treated seriously. But it's laborious work. It takes a lot of time, you know, going through the archives and going through boxes and boxes of papers, and not even being guaranteed that you would find something that you could hold on to. But it's a very good question. I think there's a very real possibility that every museum has this.
Gina, you might want to talk about, I mean, one of our bigger initiatives right now is looking at our Native American collection. And certainly we know there are things, you know, like most museums, we did, comply with the NAGPRA laws, but the research for that was done 20 years ago. And how you can research today and the kinds of material that's available, the people the communities, the Native communities are completely different, so that just really needs to continue to happen. And so we have a new fellow who's focused on the Native American collection and beginning to do some more. Some of our Native American objects, we don't even really know enough about them to know which community to talk to about them. You know, so we've got a lot of work to do there.
It's true.
There are no more questions. I have two announcements before I thank our
Sure,
speakers.
thank you.
One is, of course, that we invite you to have wine and food and more conversation after this. And this was, we have one more conversation going on next week with Barnaby Evans. And then 2 weeks from now, we have a big exhibition opening. And you're all welcome to attend, where we commission an artist, Jasmine Lee Johnson, to create a work of art in the hallway responding to the wallpaper. And they will be unveiled. That's why we don't have a talk here on that night. Thursday night around 6 o'clock with the African drumming band and a lot of stuff going on, and it's going to be fantastic. And the hallway will be transformed into a work of art that responds to the wallpaper, which will vanish underneath a new sort of layered screen print by this local artist, Jasmine Lee Johnson, who was a terrific artist, absolutely amazing. And it's part of a conference that also includes the Leah Rayana wallpaper interpretation installation, which is currently on show at this art gallery. So there's a lot happening in the final 2 weeks of the semester. But I don't want to distract from my main purpose at this moment, but just to say this was just exactly the highlight of our series that I'd hoped for, really interesting and well done.
It's fun to be here. Thank you for your interest.
Yes. Thank you.